It was a quiet Sunday in the fall of 1988 when 13-year-old Rachel Whitmore, the daughter of a respected local pastor, disappeared without a trace. One moment she was seated in the front pew, singing softly during the evening hymn. The next, she was gone. No sound, no struggle, no clue. The church locked its doors that night to whispers of grief and suspicion. Some believed she had run away. Others, more quietly, feared something darker had crept into the sanctuary. Her family prayed. The town searched. But Rachel was never found. 17 years later, long after hope had been buried beneath silence and sermons, a forgotten corner of the church gave up a secret. During restoration work behind the ancient pipe organ, an area no one had touched for decades, a small object fell from the wall. Dusty, tarnished, and delicate. A silver locket, engraved with the initials RW inside. A faded photo of Rachel and her father, taken the summer before she vanished. The discovery didn't just reopen old wounds. It unearthed questions no one was ready to ask. How could her locket have ended up behind the organ, sealed in a space accessible only from inside the walls? Who had placed it there? And why had the church leadership, known for its secrecy and control, never initiated a deeper investigation? Rumors spread like wildfire. Some claimed it was a sign from beyond. Others said the truth had been hidden from the start, veiled behind scripture and stained glass. The locket wasn't just an object. It was a key, a crack in the facade, and it begged to be followed. Rachel's story is not just a cold case. It is a reflection of how faith can be used to cover what should be confronted, and how a place meant to bring comfort can sometimes bury the very pain it should help heal. What happened to her in that church? What secrets have remained entombed within those walls, guarded by silence and tradition? And more importantly, who still knows more than they're willing to confess? Tonight, we will journey through the events leading up to Rachel's disappearance, the haunting discovery of her locket, and the chilling revelations that followed. But be warned, this is not just a mystery. It is a reckoning, a test of how far one community was willing to go to protect its image, even if it meant sacrificing one of its own. The Whitmore family was the very image of small-town virtue. Pastor Jonathan Whitmore had led the congregation of St. Emery's Church for over a decade, known for his solemn sermons and unshakable composure. Rachel, his only daughter, was quiet but radiant, with a kindness that made her unforgettable to those who truly knew her. Her mother, Anne, led the church choir and organized charity drives. They were the family everyone admired, and the family everyone whispered about when tragedy struck. Because when Rachel vanished, so did the sense of certainty the community had come to rely on. The last confirmed sighting of Rachel was just after the Sunday evening service on October 2nd. Several parishioners remembered her helping to fold hymnals, her laughter faint under the hush of closing prayers. Then nothing. She didn't come home for dinner. Her bed remained untouched. Her shoes were still by the front door. At first, there was panic. Then, a chilling quiet. The police searched the area, drained the nearby creek, questioned neighbors. But no clues surfaced. No signs of a break-in, no calls, no body. Pastor Whitmore continued preaching that week, his voice trembling beneath verses about suffering and unseen trials. And stopped singing. She stopped speaking altogether. A week passed. Then two. Soon, the urgency gave way to resignation. The official narrative suggested Rachel had likely run away, though no note had been left, no money taken, and no motive ever discovered. The church discouraged speculation. Let God be the judge, one elder said. Faith, not fear, another insisted. The congregation obeyed, and the silence became doctrine. But not everyone believed it. Rachel's best friend, Leah, then 15, never accepted the idea that she'd run. Rachel would have told me, she once said. We shared everything. Over time, Leah began to ask questions. Quietly, carefully. She noticed changes in how the adults around her behaved, particularly those in leadership. Meetings that used to be open became closed-door affairs. Sermons began to focus heavily on obedience, sin, secrets. And every time she mentioned Rachel's name, a strange tension filled the room. 17 years passed. Leah moved away, started a life of her own. But Rachel remained with her face in dreams, her voice in memories. When Leah returned to St. Emery's for a funeral years later, she noticed the same heavy atmosphere lingering in the church. Something wasn't right. And then, a week later, the restoration project began, an attempt to update the church's ancient structure. The organ hadn't been moved in decades, and behind it, the truth began to stir. The workers who discovered the locket weren't even from the town. They were hired from out of state, brought in to handle the sensitive repairs on the century-old organ. It was one of them who found the small metal object lodged between two hollow beams behind the wall. At first, they thought it was just a piece of debris, until they saw the initials and the photograph inside. When they reported it, the church leadership acted quickly, almost too quickly. The locket was taken, the discovery downplayed, and the workers asked to keep the matter discreet. But word got out. Leah was one of the first to hear the rumor. It spread in fragmented whispers. They found something. It was hers, behind the organ. Her heart sank. The organ had always been symbolic in St. Emery's, a towering structure of brass and polished wood, played only on holy days. No one had ever been allowed near it unsupervised. Rachel, Leah remembered, had once said it gave her the chills. She didn't like its sound, said it felt like something watching her from the pipes. At the time, Leah thought it was just imagination. Now she wasn't sure. Fueled by a mixture of fear and loyalty, Leah contacted the worker who found the locket. He was hesitant, but eventually agreed to speak. It wasn't just lying there, he said. It was wedged deep, as if someone had placed it there from the inside. He also mentioned something else. There had been an old, sealed crawl space behind the organ, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. It led nowhere. A dead end. Or so they were told. But what if it hadn't always been? Leah returned to the church alone, late one afternoon. She walked the perimeter slowly, studying it like a stranger. She noticed things she had never paid attention to before, scratches on the wall beneath the organ, faint markings in the stone floor. And then she saw it, a discoloration in the paneling behind the altar, as if a door had once existed there. Her heart pounded. She felt like she was trespassing in sacred space. But she also felt Rachel's presence, urgent, waiting, needing someone to finish what she never could. That night, Leah wrote down everything. Names, timelines, questions. She began to unravel the carefully constructed timeline presented back in 1988. And the more she uncovered, the clearer it became. Rachel hadn't vanished because she wanted to. She had been removed, hidden, and whatever had happened behind that organ, inside those walls, had been covered not just with stone and wood, but with silence, obedience, and fear disguised as faith. Leah's obsession grew quietly, like ivy reclaiming old stone. She visited archives, scanned newspapers from that forgotten October, and found gaps, details that didn't align, statements that felt rehearsed. Curiously, the initial police report was missing from the public records. The only documentation available was a short blurb in the Town Gazette, calling it an unfortunate case of youthful rebellion. There were no follow-up articles, no press releases from the church. It was as though Rachel's disappearance had been collectively erased. She reached out to Rachel's father, Pastor Jonathan Whitmore, now retired and living in near-total seclusion. He refused to see her. In his last public sermon, delivered 5 years after Rachel vanished, he spoke only of storms that take the faithful by surprise and the burden of unanswered prayers. He never mentioned her name again. Some said he had grown cold. Others whispered of guilt. But one thing was certain. His grief had been locked away, the same way the locket had been. And Whitmore, Rachel's mother, had passed in 1999. Her obituary made no mention of Rachel, not even as survived by. That omission alone pierced Leah in a place words could not reach. She remembered, and as soft-spoken, gentle, always humming during choir practice. But toward the end, she had changed, grown quieter, her eyes distant. A woman not just mourning, but haunted. Leah now wondered how much and had known, and whether she had carried that weight to her grave. Digging deeper, Leah found that the renovation blueprints for the church listed a narrow maintenance tunnel sealed in 1991, 3 years after Rachel's disappearance. According to the contractor's notes, the tunnel had been blocked for security and safety reasons. But no safety hazard was ever reported. No one could explain why it had suddenly been deemed dangerous. She requested access. The church declined. They cited liability issues. And just like that, the door closed again. But this time, Leah wasn't alone. A former youth pastor named Mark, who had served at St. Emery's in the late 1980s, reached out after hearing of a renewed search. "I always wondered why Rachel was never spoken of," he said. "It was like we were told, unofficially, not to bring her up, not even in prayer." Mark had grown uncomfortable with the church's response back then. Now, after learning about the Locket, he was ready to talk. There was something wrong with that building, he whispered, and with the people who ran it. Mark's recollections were filled with subtle clues, things he hadn't realized were strange until looking back. He recalled hearing footsteps in the sanctuary late at night, long after everyone had gone. He remembered the smell of candle wax in rooms where no candles had been lit. Once, he found a rosary melted into the wood near the organ, as if it had been held too tightly for too long. But it was a particular memory that made Leah go cold. "Rachel came to me 2 weeks before she vanished," Mark said, his voice tight. "She was scared. Said someone had followed her during confession. He never reported it. He didn't know how. At the time, it sounded like a child's fear, irrational, dramatic. Now, it felt like a missed chance to stop something irreversible." Leah pressed him for more. She said she heard someone breathing behind the partition. Not the priest. Someone else. That detail haunted Leah. It meant Rachel had sensed danger inside the church. Not outside. Not in the world. But inside the one place she was supposed to be safe. Leah and Mark met late one evening outside the church. Armed with a flashlight, old plans of the building, and a desperate need for truth, they entered through the side door. The sanctuary was silent. The organ loomed like a relic of a forgotten era. They made their way behind it, to the crawl space the workers had spoken of. With effort, they pried open the panel and found darkness. A tunnel. Narrow, choked with dust, but real. They crawled in, inch by inch, flashlight beams cutting through decades of neglect. The tunnel turned sharply, then ended at a hollow, barely large enough for a person to sit upright. Inside were remnants, a broken hymnal, a button from a uniform, and a child's ribbon, crimson, with Rachel's initials sewn in tiny cursive near the edge. Leah held it in shaking hands. Her breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just where Rachel had been hidden. It might have been where she had cried, where she had waited, where she had been silenced. And suddenly, the question wasn't how she vanished. It was why. Who had the access, the opportunity, and the motive to trap a child behind the walls of a church? Who had decided her voice was too dangerous to be heard? And why had a locket, once close to her heart, been the only piece allowed to surface? Leah didn't sleep that night. Her hands trembled as she replayed the tunnel discovery again and again in her mind. The ribbon, the hymnal, the unbearable smallness of the space. It all screamed of one thing: entrapment. Rachel hadn't run. She had been taken. And whoever had done it had used the church's very structure to hide her. Leah sat in her car outside the building for hours, watching the stained glass reflect the early morning light, feeling the weight of everything St. Emery's had claimed to be, and everything it now represented. She returned home and laid out all her notes. Every inconsistency, every buried clue. It was time to trace a line between the pieces. She looked back at the church leadership from 1988. One name stood out: Deacon Thomas Lyle. Quiet, reserved, a man few remembered clearly, except for his eerie presence. He had abruptly resigned just months after Rachel vanished, citing health concerns, and moved to another state. Leah tracked him down, now an elderly man living in a care home under a new last name. His eyes, when she visited, were dim, but when she said Rachel's name, they flinched. At first, he denied everything, said he didn't remember, that she was confusing things. But when Leah placed the ribbon on the table between them, something shifted. His hands twitched. His breathing changed. "That was a long time ago," he muttered. "Mistakes were made. I was young. I didn't know." But he stopped. His voice cracked. "I didn't mean for it to go that far." Leah leaned in, her voice steady. "What did you mean happened?" He didn't answer. He just whispered. She wouldn't stop asking questions. Those 5 words hit Leah like a cold wind. Rachel had seen something, maybe heard something, and had become inconvenient. And in a place where obedience was prized above truth, silencing her had become easier than facing whatever she had uncovered. Leah demanded to know who else was involved. Thomas shook his head. You think I was the only one? He asked. No one does something like that alone in a place like that. He didn't name names, but his eyes filled with tears. She cried for days, he said. And then it was quiet. Leah left shaken, but not defeated. She had enough now. Not for legal charges. Too much time had passed, and too many people were dead or disappeared. But she had truth. Fractured, painful, devastating truth. Rachel hadn't been forgotten. She had been erased, and Leah had made her visible again. What remained was to understand the full picture. Not just who did this, but what Rachel had discovered that made her a threat in the first place. The deeper Leah looked, the more sinister the pattern became. Old financial record from St. Emery's revealed something unsettling. An unreported series of cash donations made in the summer of 1988 from anonymous sources. The amounts were large, irregular, and oddly timed. One just days after Rachel vanished. Another following Deacon Lyle's resignation. Leah cross-referenced the names on the deposit slips with church members from that era. One stood out, Harold Drayton, a wealthy businessman and longtime board member who had always kept a low profile. Harold had passed away in 2003, but his estate was still in the family. Leah managed to contact his son, David, now a lawyer in a neighboring city. He was polite but guarded. My father was devoted to the church, he said. Whatever you're implying, I assure you, he was no criminal. Leah didn't argue. She simply asked if David had ever heard his father mention Rachel. There was a long pause. Then, only once, he said something about that girl who didn't know when to keep quiet. I thought it was strange. I was a teenager. I didn't ask questions. The phrase haunted Leah. It matched what Lyle had said. Rachel had seen something, maybe about money, maybe about behavior, something they needed to bury. But what would a 13-year-old even know to look for? Leah turned back to Rachel's diary, recovered years earlier from her belongings. Most of it was innocent, typical reflections of a young girl. But near the back, a single entry, dated 2 weeks before her disappearance, stood out. I saw Mr. D in the side room again. He was angry. He yelled at someone. Said no one could find out. I told Sister Marjorie, but she told me to forget it. Sister Marjorie had been a fixture in the church for years, a stern, loyal woman who had mentored Rachel in Sunday school. Leah found her, now living in a convent. When approached, she refused to speak. The past is behind us, she said firmly. Nothing good comes from dragging up what the Lord has already buried. Leah didn't push, but she knew the truth now. Rachel had uncovered something illicit. She tried to tell the right people, and the right people turned away. And that, perhaps, was the greatest betrayal. Not just what happened behind those walls, but how everyone chose silence over justice. Leah stood alone in St. Emery's sanctuary days later, listening to the way her footsteps echoed off the cold stone. She thought of Rachel, sitting in those pews, watching everything, understanding more than she was ever meant to, and realizing, too late, that truth without power was dangerous, especially for a girl who refused to be quiet. Leah's investigation had now entered a space beyond memory, into legacy, into trauma. What began as a quiet inquiry had unraveled into something sacred, something damning. She no longer questioned whether Rachel had died within those walls. She felt it, knew it. But more haunting was the realization that it hadn't been a crime of passion or a moment of madness. It had been deliberate, cold, systemic, a coordinated act of erasure inside a house meant for grace. The tunnel, the crawl space, the sealed panel, none of it had been discovered accidentally. It had been designed. Someone or several someones had created those voids for a purpose, not to protect, but to imprison. Leah began speaking to contractors who had worked on St. Emery's during the 70s and 80s. Most were gone or unreachable. But one, a retired stonemason named Ellis Monroe, agreed to meet. When she showed him the old blueprints, he frowned. That wall wasn't original, he said, pointing to the panel behind the organ. It was added later. We were told it was to insulate sound, but that never made sense. Ellis revealed something even more chilling. During that renovation, Pastor Whitmore himself had ordered work to be done at night, when no congregation would be present. He paid extra for discretion. At the time, we thought he was just private, Ellis said. Now I'm not so sure. Leah asked him directly. Was there enough space behind the organ for someone to hide a person? He nodded. Yes, but not for long. Not without wanting them to disappear. The final piece came from an unexpected place. A letter, sent anonymously to Leah's mailbox, postmarked with no return address. Inside, a single page. I heard her crying the night she vanished. I was too afraid to speak. I still am. But I need someone to know. She never left the church. Not by her own will. The letter was signed only with the initials SM, Sister Marjorie. The silence she once defended had cracked. And that small, terrified confession changed everything. Rachel's voice was rising, not from her lips, but from the fracture she had left in others. Those who had watched. Those who had obeyed. Those who had done nothing. The walls of St. Emery's were no longer just witnesses. They were accomplices. And Leah knew then. She would not stop until every stone that had kept Rachel hidden was forced to remember her name. The town had grown uneasy. Whispers of Leah's search had spread beyond the church pews, into grocery aisles and gas stations. Some called her a truth seeker. Others, a troublemaker. A few urged her to stop, to let the dead rest. But Rachel hadn't rested. Not for 17 long years. And now that the truth had begun to surface, it stirred something ancient and uncomfortable in the town's collective memory, a guilt that had gone dormant, but never truly died. Leah held a small community gathering, not in the church, but at the town library. She didn't accuse. She didn't demand. She simply laid out the facts. The locket, the crawl space, the letter, the diary entry, the timeline. Faces in the crowd turned pale. A few walked out, but some stayed. Some wept. One woman, trembling, stood and said softly, I remember that night. I thought I heard something behind the organ, but I was too afraid to check. Another admitted that the church elders had discouraged volunteers from helping with the search. They said the police had it under control, she said. But I always felt that wasn't true. After the meeting, a man in his 60s approached Leah with trembling hands. He had been a janitor at St. Emery's for over 20 years. They told me to seal the door, he whispered. Said it was for insulation, but it had locks. From the outside. And I just did it. His eyes welled with tears. I didn't know, I swear. But I should have asked more questions. I should have done something. His regret soaked the room. Leah recorded everything. She was building not a legal case, but a moral reckoning. And with each voice added to the record, the silence that had once suffocated Rachel's truth began to thin. Leah wrote everything into a dossier. Not to submit to courts, but to history, to memory, to Rachel. She titled it, What the Walls Remember. And inside that record, she included a final photograph, one that had never been seen before. Taken the summer before Rachel vanished. She was sitting in the grass outside St. Emery's, locket around her neck, eyes lit with defiance and wonder. It wasn't just a picture. It was a question, a challenge, a legacy. And the world, at last, was beginning to listen. In the weeks that followed, Leah's home became a sanctuary of voices. Letters arrived, some anonymous, others signed with trembling hands. Former church members, now in distant states, reached out to share things they had long buried. A retired Sunday school teacher wrote about overhearing Rachel pleading with someone in the vestry. A former choir member recalled seeing Rachel's father pacing the sanctuary alone late into the night, days after her disappearance, his hands covered in dust. None of it was enough for a conviction, but all of it was enough for the truth. The deeper Leah went, the more she realized the silence wasn't just institutional, it was generational. Families had built their reputations on obedience, on staying quiet, on trusting those in robes and collars without question. And Rachel, at 13, had dared to question. She had broken the unspoken rule. She had seen something, heard something, and chosen not to stay quiet. And for that, she had vanished. Not just from the church, but from conversation, from history. Until now, Leah began writing articles under a pseudonym, detailing the findings. One was titled The Girl Behind the Organ. Another, What the Hymns Try to Hide. They went viral in small but fierce corners of the internet. Forums for survivors, support groups, hidden places where the unheard congregated. She didn't need the world to know. She just needed enough people to understand. And they did. People began to send her stories of their own. Different churches. Different decades. but always the same patterns. Always the same silence. One email in particular stood out. It came from a woman in her 40s. She had attended St. Emery's as a child. She remembered Rachel. She protected me. The woman wrote. One day, someone tried to get me alone. Rachel stepped in. She told me to leave and never be alone in that hallway again. I never understood why. But now I do. Leah stared at the screen for a long time, her throat tight. Rachel hadn't just seen something. She had acted. She had fought, even as a child. And in that moment, Leah understood something else. Rachel hadn't died a victim. She had died resisting. She had died trying to protect someone else. And for 17 years, the silence hadn't only buried her. It had buried what she stood for. But now, through Leah's hands, her words, and the voices she awakened, that resistance was finally being remembered. St. Emery's remained open, though its pews were no longer full. A few loyal congregants still came, clinging to the comfort of ritual and the denial that came with it. But the walls felt different now. The hymns sounded thinner. The silence between prayers seemed heavier, aware of everything it had once concealed. Even the organ's voice, once booming, now trembled with age, each note a strained echo of something long broken. One morning, Leah received a call from a new priest assigned to the church. He was young, unfamiliar with the town's scars, but he had read her articles. Quietly, secretly. I've seen the sealed panel, he said. I know something was hidden there. She didn't ask for his name. She simply thanked him for listening, for believing. He didn't promise change, but he did something rare. He offered access, full access, to every room, every record, every shadowed corner of the church. When Leah returned to St. Emery's one final time, she brought with her a single item, Rachel's locket, which had been returned to her after the investigation went cold. She walked the same path Rachel had taken on that October day, past the pews, down the aisle, to the foot of the organ. The new priest stood back, silent. She didn't need him to speak. She opened the locket, kissed the photo inside, and placed it gently at the base of the pipes. The church was silent, but not oppressive. It was listening. Finally, and in that silence, Leah spoke Rachel's name aloud. Not as a question, not as a wound, but as a promise. You were right, she whispered. They were afraid of what you saw. And now, the whole world sees it too. Her voice didn't tremble. It rang with quiet defiance. The same kind Rachel once carried, before the walls tried to swallow her whole. And as Leah stepped outside, the sun broke through the stained glass, casting color across the sanctuary floor. The same floor where Rachel once stood, once laughed, once warned others with more bravery than anyone ever gave her credit for. The girl who disappeared had finally reappeared, not in body, but in truth. And truth, once spoken, doesn't vanish. It waits. It endures. And when the time is right, it speaks. The discovery of the truth did not bring justice in a courtroom, but it brought justice in memory. Rachel's story, once sealed behind wood and stone, now lived freely in voices around the country. Survivors of silence, some from churches, some from schools, some from their own families, reached out to Leah, thanking her not for solving a mystery, but for naming something they had carried inside for years, the loneliness of being disbelieved. Rachel had become more than a girl who vanished. She had become a symbol for every child who asked the wrong question, every woman who was told to sit down, every truth that trembled on the edge of confession and was pulled back in fear. People began to light candles for her, not just at St. Emery's, but in living rooms, in street corners, in communities she had never touched in life. Her name had become a prayer not for closure, but for courage. One night, Leah received a package in the mail. Inside, a handbound book titled The Girl Who Spoke Too Soon. It was written by a young author in Oregon, inspired by the articles Leah had posted. The story was fiction, names changed, events softened, but the heart of it was unmistakably Rachel's. In the dedication, one line read, "For the girl who was right, and for those who finally said so." Leah held the book to her chest. She wept, not for the tragedy, but for the resurrection of truth. Meanwhile, at St. Emery's, subtle changes began to take root. The new priest removed the locked confessionals and replaced them with open prayer rooms. The organ, once towering and menacing, was dismantled for restoration. Behind it, he placed a plaque, not flashy, not announced, but quietly carved into oak, in memory of the one we failed to protect. We hear you now. Those who saw it understood. Those who didn't weren't ready to. Leah never returned to church after that. She didn't need to. Rachel's spirit no longer lived inside those walls. It had moved into the world, where it belonged. In the ripple of every voice that refused to be hushed. In the breath of every story that dares to begin with "This is what happened to me." Rachel had been silenced once. But now, her voice had multiplied. And once a voice multiplies, it becomes movement. Years passed. The case of Rachel Whitmore became a quiet legacy, not in courts or headlines, but in people, in the small decisions they made, to speak, to write, to listen. Leah continued her work, shifting her focus to helping others tell their own stories. She didn't chase justice anymore. She cultivated remembrance, because justice doesn't always look like punishment. Sometimes, it looks like truth surviving in spite of everything built to kill it. Rachel's locket remained at the foot of the old organ space, now transformed into a memorial nook where flowers and handwritten notes appeared weekly. One such note read, "Because of you, I finally told someone what happened to me. Thank you for not giving up." Another simply said, "You were right." Rachel had become what she always was, brave. And through Leah, that bravery had become contagious. Leah published a book compiling her investigation, the testimonies, and her personal journey. She didn't use Rachel's name as a brand. She protected it, honored it, and titled the book Stone by Stone. The message was clear. Systems of silence are built slowly, but they can be taken down the same way. Patiently, relentlessly. One stone, one truth, one voice at a time. Some people still refuse to believe. Some still called it rumor, conspiracy, exaggeration. But that didn't matter anymore. The record had been corrected, not by courts, but by hearts. And those hearts would carry the truth longer than any verdict, longer than any denial. The locket may have been found behind the organ, but Rachel had been hiding in memory all along, waiting for someone to open the door. And in the end, that door was not opened by force. It was opened by love. Love that demanded honesty. Love that refused to forget. Love that looked at a sealed panel in a sacred space and said, "This does not belong here. She deserves the light." And finally, after 17 years in darkness, she got it. Somewhere along the way, Rachel's story outgrew the walls of St. Emery's. Her name began appearing in academic papers, in workshops about institutional silence, in seminars on trauma-informed faith spaces. Leah was invited to speak, not as an expert, but as a witness. She told the story not with drama, but with gravity. "This isn't a story about ghosts," she would say. "It's about what happens when we treat questions like curses and silence like salvation." In one such talk, a young woman approached her after the session, eyes filled with tears. "My sister disappeared from our church in 1995, she whispered. "They said she left. I don't believe that anymore. Your story helped me believe what I already knew." Leah hugged her, not as a savior, but as someone who had once stood in that same hollow space between doubt and truth, between grief and fury, and most of all, between silence and voice. Meanwhile, Leah worked quietly with survivors from across the country to build an online archive, a digital sanctuary, not of theology, not a doctrine, but of memory. It was named Rachel's Light. It allowed people to submit their stories anonymously or signed, share artwork, poems, even just a line, "I was there too." Thousands came. Some stayed. Some wrote and never returned. But the silence, once thick like fog, now scattered like ash and wind. Back in her town, the name Rachel Whitmore was no longer spoken with shame or discomfort. Children asked who she was. Parents told them, not as a warning, but as a lesson. Her story became a part of the community's truth. Teachers referenced her when discussing ethics, pastors when discussing courage, and more than one mural quietly appeared on brick walls. Her face, her initials, a golden locket painted like a beacon beneath her collarbone. Leah never claimed to be the hero. She always made that clear. Rachel was the brave one, she wrote. She was the one who tried to speak when no one wanted to listen. "I just came back to hear her." And that sentence, simple as it was, would be quoted for years in places Rachel would have never imagined. Because in the end, The girl who vanished in 1988 didn't disappear. She multiplied. Leah often returned to the place where it all began, not to St. Emery's, but to the small hill just behind it, where Rachel and she used to sit as kids watching the sun dip below the steeple. It was quiet there, sacred in its own way. It wasn't lined with stained glass or filled with hymns, but it held something more precious, memory unfiltered by fear. She would bring a journal, sometimes just to sit, sometimes to write, sometimes to speak. "I still wonder if you were scared," she once whispered. "I still wonder if you hoped someone would come sooner." And though no answer came, the wind moved through the grass like a sigh. Not sad, not angry, just alive. Rachel, she had come to believe, was not somewhere else. She was here, in every truth spoken, in every silence broken, in every girl who chose to ask why when the world begged her not to. A school near St. Emery's eventually named its library after Rachel. A plaque near the entrance read, "For the child who saw too much and still wanted others to see." That library would become a safe space for kids who felt strange, loud, curious, and out of place. And on the anniversary of her disappearance each year, students gathered to read a story aloud. Not because the school told them to, but because they wanted to, because her voice had become tradition. Leah, in her later years, would often be asked how she carried so much. "I didn't carry it," she'd replied gently. "I listened to it. And once you listen to a story like Rachel's, it carries you." She never moved from the town. She never wrote another book. She said all she needed to say in that one act of return, the moment she stood in the sanctuary and chose to ask again what everyone else had learned to ignore. And in that choice, a girl hidden behind a church organ for 17 years became something no wall, no silence, no fear could contain again. She became voice. She became witness. And most of all, she became a story no one would ever bury again. There was something poetic about how Rachel's name began to appear, not on gravestones, but in gardens, in notebooks, in whispered bedtime stories told by mothers to daughters. There was a girl once who asked questions others were too afraid to ask. That's how it always began, not with how she disappeared, but with how she lived. Slowly, she was reclaimed, not just from tragedy, but from being defined solely by it. She was not just a girl who vanished. She was the girl who saw, who spoke, who mattered. Leah watched all of this unfold like someone watching a star long believed extinguished suddenly appear in the night sky. Bright, permanent. She was invited to schools and churches. Yes, but more powerfully, she was invited into living rooms. Families would tell her, "You helped us tell the truth at our dinner table." That, to Leah, meant more than any podium. Because truth begins where it's hardest to speak, at home, in the heart. Rachel's story inspired others to open old wounds. Cold cases were revisited. Pastors stepped down. Survivors came forward. It wasn't clean. It wasn't always safe. But it was real, and real was enough. In some places, people responded with denial, anger, threats. Leah expected it. She had learned that wherever truth walks in, resistance follows. But she also knew something stronger had entered the room each time. Rachel. The little girl with the ribbon and the locket had outlived her silence. And now she walked with others. In courtrooms, in prayer circles, in therapist offices. She became the name survivors whispered before telling their own stories. "I heard about Rachel, and that gave me the strength to tell you mine." She became not just a story, but a threshold, a before and after. And once someone crossed it, they never returned the same. And so, St. Emery's changed too. Not quickly, not completely, but enough. Enough for candles to be lit in her name. Enough for sermons to speak of courage over compliance. Enough for little girls to sit in pews with their backs straight and their questions unashamed. And somewhere in the echo of those changes, Rachel remained, watching not from above, but from within. From every voice that chose to say, "I will not be quiet anymore." A decade later, a young woman walked into the room of voices at a nearby community center, an archive built for those who had once been silenced. She looked through shelves of handwritten letters, printed emails, voice recordings. And there, in the center display, was Rachel's locket. Simple, silver, untouched by time. She stood still for a long moment, then reached in her coat and pulled out her own ribbon, blue, with initials sewn in the corner. She placed it beside the locket and whispered, "Me too." She had never met Rachel, had never lived in the same state. But she knew her. They all did. Rachel had become myth, yes, but not distant, not unreachable. She had become a symbol that didn't float above pain, but walked alongside it, that whispered not be brave, but you already are. For that young woman, as for so many, Rachel was proof that stories don't die when buried. They wait. Leah, now older and no longer seeking the spotlight, still kept a worn envelope in her drawer. Inside was the original anonymous letter that broke the silence, the one that read, "I heard her crying the night she vanished." She had read it hundreds of times, memorized every curve of every letter, not because it solved everything, but because it reminded her that someone knew, someone cared, someone, even in fear, had told the truth. In one of her last recorded interviews, Leah was asked what she believed Rachel would say now. She paused for a long time, eyes distant, then said softly, she'd say thank you. Not to me, to the ones who finally chose to hear her. That was Rachel's victory. Not revenge, not exposure, but recognition. The kind that says, you mattered. You still matter. And as the world moved forward, shifting and uncertain, one thing remained steady. Somewhere in a quiet church, in the breath between songs, in the warm hands of someone daring to tell their truth for the first time, Rachel still speaks. In a quiet ceremony, St. Emery's Church installed a new stained glass window. It didn't depict saints or angels or crucifixes. It showed a tree. At its base, a girl with windswept hair sat reading a book, a silver locket resting just over her heart. The roots of the tree twisted down deep, touching every corner of the glass, and the branches stretched outward into skies of deep blue and gold. At the bottom was a single phrase, "Truth takes root." It was the congregation's way of saying, we remember, we admit, we begin again. The artist who created the window had never known Rachel, but she painted the girl's face with clarity, as though guided by something sacred. "I just imagined someone who saw everything, and chose to stay anyway," she said. The image quickly became known throughout the town, not as a decoration, but as a monument. Children pointed at it. Elderly members sat beneath it and wept. And in the evenings, when the sun poured through it, the sanctuary glowed like it never had before. Leah attended the unveiling with quiet reverence. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The moment spoke for itself. Rachel's presence, once hidden behind a wooden panel and smothered beneath silence, was now made of light, burning through glass for all to see. It was a restoration not of innocence, but of dignity, of agency, of the kind of justice that doesn't end with punishment, but with remembrance. In the weeks that followed, young girls began leaving notes at the foot of the window. Short messages. "I believe you. Thank you for not being quiet. I asked a question today." No one told them to do it. They just did, because they understood, in ways that can't be taught, that silence is no longer the only option. That voice is holy too. That even in a place once ruled by obedience, truth can find its way back in. And so Rachel lived on, not in whispers, but in echoes. Not behind the organ, but beneath glass and sky and memory. She became part of the air in St. Emery's, not haunting it, but healing it. And those who entered now walked not into a place of buried secrets, but into one where even the smallest voice could find its way to the front pew. Leah's life slowed with time. She wrote less, traveled less, but the legacy she had sparked continued to grow in unexpected places. In a church in Montana, a young woman launched a program for young survivors, calling it the Rachel Project. In university in London, a professor assigned Leah's articles in a course titled Faith and Power. In a podcast that reached thousands, Rachel's story was told by a host who ended every episode with, "Let the unheard be heard." But perhaps most remarkably, a woman named Naomi, once a child in St. Emery's choir, came forward years later to tell her story publicly. "Rachel warned me once," she said. "She told me to stay away from the back hallway. I thought she was just being protective. I didn't realize she was trying to save me." Naomi, now a mother herself, shared her story not with bitterness, but with grace. "She didn't just save me. She saved who I became." That kind of love outlives everything. Leah watched all of this from her porch. She received letters from strangers, Gifts she never expected, ribbons, lockets, even drawings from children who had heard Rachel's story in schools. One drawing in particular hung on her wall, a girl standing with her arms wide open in front of a massive door, sunlight pouring in behind her. No fear, no chains, just freedom. At the bottom, the child had written, "Rachel, let the light in." And in her final journal, Leah wrote one last entry, only 3 lines long. She spoke. We listened. She lives. Because stories like Rachel's don't end. They ripple. They plant roots in silence. And when the time is right, they bloom. Years after the window was installed, a local documentary filmmaker approached Leah. He wanted to tell Rachel's story, not as a sensational mystery, but as a human truth. Leah hesitated. She had protected the story like a living thing, careful not to let it be exploited or misunderstood. But the filmmaker, Jonah, was different. He didn't ask about suspects or conspiracies. He asked about legacy, about Rachel's courage, about what happens when a community is forced to see itself clearly. The film, titled Behind the Organ, premiered in a small theater. It was quiet, simple, no dramatic music, no reenactments, just testimony. Leah, Mark, Naomi, a former parishioner who cried through her entire interview. And Jonah's camera, patient, never invasive, capturing the weight of every pause. In the final scene, Leah walked through St. Emery's, stopped in front of the stained glass window, and whispered, "We were wrong to forget her. We will not do it again." The audience left in silence. Not the kind of silence that buries, but the kind that lets things settle deep. The kind that holds space for transformation. In the days that followed, the film spread online. Quietly. Virally. People didn't share it with emojis or dramatic headlines. They shared it with captions like, "Please watch this. This reminded me of someone I lost. I see her now." And then came the letters. Dozens. Then hundreds. From teachers. From survivors. From ministers and therapists and strangers who never met Rachel but felt they had. One father wrote, "My daughter told me about something that happened to her last year. She said Rachel gave her the courage. That saved her life." Leah read every letter. She answered most, but one she kept separate. A simple card from a retired clergyman who once served at St. Emery's. "I was silent. I see that now. I carry her name with me every day. I am sorry." Leah didn't need justice anymore. She needed that. The recognition. The reverence. Not for herself. For Rachel. Because when even those who once turned away finally turned toward the truth, it meant the silence had not won. The seasons shifted. The wind over the hill behind St. Emery's felt different, lighter, almost expectant. One morning, a group of students visited the church on a history field trip. They stood before the stained glass window, listening to their teacher speak about Rachel Whitmore, not as a ghost story, not as a tragedy, but as a turning point. One girl raised her hand and asked, "Why didn't anyone help her?" The teacher hesitated, then answered, "Sometimes adults are too afraid of the truth, but brave kids remind them how to find it again." That answer rippled. Weeks later, the same girl gave a school presentation titled, "The Girl Who Wasn't Quiet." She didn't just tell Rachel's story. She invited classmates to write down something they'd always wanted to say, but never felt safe enough to share. The papers were pinned to a board outside the auditorium. One read, "I've been hiding who I am." Another, "I miss my mom every day." And another, folded and signed with a single initial, "It happened to me, too." Rachel's name appeared nowhere on those notes. And yet, she was in every one. She had become a vessel for others to fill with their own truths. Not to take from her, but to carry her forward. Her story had become air, silent, invisible, and everywhere. In truth spoken for the first time. In silence broken gently, bravely, without shame. Leah visited the board months later, standing in the hallway of a school she had never entered before. She ran her hand along the edges of the pinned papers, not reading them all, just feeling them. She closed her eyes and imagined Rachel standing beside her, older now, proud. Not of the pain, but of what was born from it. Not of being remembered, but of being understood. And in that quiet moment, Leah whispered aloud the sentence that had lived in her heart for decades, waiting for the world to be ready. She didn't disappear. She led the way. One crisp autumn morning, nearly 4 decades after Rachel vanished, St. Emery's hosted a special service. It wasn't for a holiday or a dedication. It was for remembrance, not just of Rachel, but of all voices once silenced, forgotten, or dismissed. The church had changed. The pulpit now belonged to a woman pastor who had grown up in the very same pews where Rachel once sat. She had never known her personally, but carried her name like a sacred vow. The sanctuary was full. Survivors, families, children who had grown into adults under Rachel's light. They sang hymns, some traditional, some rewritten with lyrics that honored healing over hiding. And in the middle of the service, a girl no older than 12 stepped forward to read a poem she had written. Her voice trembled at first, but grew stronger with each word. She was a girl who asked the sky to speak, and when it did, we finally listened. The room was silent. Then it wept. After the service, attendees were invited to walk through a new memorial garden behind the church. At its center stood a tree, grown from a sapling planted the year Rachel's locket was found. It now towered tall and unbending. Branches stretched upward as though reaching for something eternal. Around its base were dozens of ribbons tied in soft blues and silvers, symbols of remembrance, resilience, and return. Leah stood near the edge of the crowd, not wanting to take attention, but unable to stay away. Her eyes were drawn to a small plaque nestled in the soil beside the tree. It read, "For Rachel," who never stopped speaking, even when we didn't listen. She knelt, brushed the dirt from the plaque with her hand, and placed a folded letter beside it, sealed, unaddressed, but full of all the things she had never said aloud. As the crowd slowly dispersed, the wind moved through the branches of the tree. The ribbons rustled gently, as if someone was passing through them, light-footed, unseen, and smiling. Some swore they heard laughter in the breeze. Others said nothing, but all of them felt it. That Rachel was there, not lost, not hidden, but home. That evening, as twilight settled over the church, Leah sat alone in the sanctuary, watching the last rays of sunlight filter through Rachel's stained glass image. The colors danced across the pews, bending into patterns like memories made visible. She thought of the first day she walked into St. Emery's so long ago, full of questions, fear, and something heavier, guilt. Now that weight had shifted. It didn't vanish, but it no longer crushed. It carried. From her coat, she pulled the original newspaper clipping, the one from 1988 announcing Rachel's disappearance. The ink had faded, the corners curled with time. But Leah read it again, as she had countless times, and this time she whispered a new ending. She was never truly missing, only waiting for us to find her the right way. She folded it back carefully and tucked it behind the pew's hymn book, a kind of offering, a kind of closure. The organ behind her, once the place of secrets, had been restored not just in wood and metal, but in meaning. It now bore an inscription carved discreetly along its side. For the music she never got to finish. Every note played from it now was a resurrection, each sound honoring the silence Rachel endured and the strength it took for others to shatter it. Outside, lanterns had been lit in the garden, flickering lights marking not death, but endurance. Families walked among them quietly, some holding hands, others letting tears fall without apology. One little boy asked his mother who Rachel was. She knelt down and answered, "She's someone who helped people remember how to care." The boy nodded. That made sense to him. And from the top of the hill, Leah watched. She didn't need a podium, didn't need applause. She had already received the only reward that mattered, knowing Rachel's voice would outlive them all. Not in fear, not in shadows, but in light. Always light. As time went on, Rachel's story became more than a narrative passed from voice to voice. It became a foundation for change. Inspired by her memory, schools in the surrounding counties adopted a new annual tradition, Day of the Unheard. It wasn't about mourning. It was about permission. Children were invited to share stories, fears, questions, anything they felt they had no space for. Teachers listened. Parents attended. And with every whispered confession, a little more silence was undone. Leah was asked to speak at the first event, but she declined. Instead, she sent a short video. In it, she stood in her modest kitchen and said simply, "Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is tell the truth before you know who's listening." Rachel did. And you can too. That clip went viral, Not because it was flashy, but because it was raw, real. It struck something deeper than sympathy. It stirred conscience. Meanwhile, across the country, a new generation of storytellers was rising. Writers, filmmakers, advocates, many of whom cited Rachel's story as their first awakening. Her name appeared in speeches, classroom essays, podcasts, even in a congressional hearing on child protection laws. Not as a case, as a catalyst. Her absence had created space, and in that space, something brave had taken root. But for Leah, the greatest impact came quietly. At a bookstore in a small town, she found a novel written by a young woman she had never met. The dedication read, "To the girl who hid behind the organ, and the woman who pulled her story into the light. This is for you." Leah bought every copy on the shelf, not out of pride, but out of awe. Rachel had never lived to tell her own story, but her story had raised 1,000 voices. And in the soft rhythm of those voices, Leah saw something beautiful. Rachel was not frozen in the past. She was evolving, breathing, changing with every soul she touched. Not as a headline, but as a quiet revolution. The town of Emeryville eventually established a small museum in the building next to St. Emery's. It wasn't grand, just a single room, painted in soft cream, with old hymnals, photographs, and handwritten letters preserved under glass. At its center stood the locket, polished, protected, its silver now gleaming softly under warm lights. It no longer looked lost. It looked placed, revered. Visitors came from across the state. Some left in tears, others in silence. A few left letters of their own, folded carefully and placed beside the display. The curator, a gentle man with a voice like rain, kept everyone in a wooden box labeled "Ongoing Stories." He believed the exhibit wasn't about history. It was about healing. People come here, he said, to remember someone they never met. And somehow, they leave remembering something about themselves. On the anniversary of the Locket's discovery, a quiet ceremony was held. Leah lit a candle. Naomi read from Rachel's childhood diary, one page that had survived in a forgotten drawer. It read, "Sometimes I feel invisible, but if God sees me, maybe that's enough." Those words landed like a soft thunder. No one spoke. No one needed to. After the ceremony, a young boy approached Leah. He held a drawing. Rachel, standing with wings, reaching out to lift another child into the air. "Is it true?" he asked. "She's an angel now." Leah knelt beside him and smiled. "No," she said gently. "She's something stronger. She's a reminder." And as the museum lights dimmed and the day came to a close, the town didn't feel haunted anymore. It felt watched over. Not by guilt, but by grace. Not by fear, but by memory that refused to be buried. Rachel had vanished, but she had also reappeared. In every act of courage, every truth spoken, every silence finally broken. In the years that followed, St. Emery's became a symbol, not of scandal, but of transformation. The church no longer hid from its past. Instead, it wore it openly, like a scar that had been stitched with care. The once silent corners now echoed with conversation and compassion. Youth groups discussed topics previously considered taboo. Counseling was offered without judgment. And in every sermon, there was a reminder that faith without accountability is merely theater. Leah often sat in the back pew on Sundays, not because she needed answers anymore, but because she needed presence. She found comfort in the creak of the wood, the flicker of candles, the quiet hum of voices joined in truth. Sometimes, she would look toward the organ, not with dread, but with reverence. That space had once been a vault of secrets. Now, it was a cradle of remembrance. One Sunday, as the choir finished their final hymn, a young girl approached Leah. She had heard about Rachel and wanted to know more, not out of morbid curiosity, but because she had a secret of her own. Leah didn't offer advice. She didn't push. She simply said, "You're not alone. You never were. And you don't have to carry it in silence." The girl nodded, her shoulders relaxing as though a weight had been lifted. That moment, quiet, almost unnoticeable, was a continuation of Rachel's legacy. The town itself had changed, too. Businesses once reluctant to speak now supported local causes addressing abuse, mental health, and childhood trauma. A new mural was painted downtown. Rachel's face, ethereal and strong, surrounded by imagery of light bursting through stained glass. Underneath, it read, "The girl who helped us see." And as Leah walked past that mural one evening, wrapped in a shawl Rachel had once worn, she smiled. Because the story no longer belonged to tragedy. It belonged to all those who had listened, changed, and chosen to live differently. Autumn returned once again, and with it, the leaves turned to gold and fire. It was the season Rachel had disappeared, but now it held new meaning. Instead of dreading its arrival, the town celebrated Rachel's week, a time to reflect, remember, and renew. The events were simple: poetry readings, candlelit walks, community dinners where people sat with strangers and shared stories they'd never told aloud before. Leah was now in her 60s, her hair streaked with silver, her voice softer, but no less certain. She spent most of her time gardening, reading, and answering the occasional letter that still arrived from someone touched by Rachel's story. But during Rachel's week, she became something else: a quiet leader, a presence, living proof that wounds can become wisdom. This year, a special event was added: the Locket ceremony. Children and teens were invited to write letters to someone they missed, feared, or loved in silence. These letters were placed in small, handmade lockets, which were then hung on the branches of the tree in the memorial garden. As the wind passed through the leaves, the lockets chimed softly, an orchestra of unheard voices finally allowed to sing. One evening, after the crowd had gone, Leah returned to the tree alone. The lockets shimmered in the moonlight, and for a moment, she imagined Rachel standing beneath them, arms outstretched, smiling as each secret found air. Leah reached in her pocket and pulled out her own letter, the last one. She had written it weeks earlier, but waited for the right moment. She tied it gently to a branch, kissed her fingertips, and whispered, "You can rest now." Above her, one locket spun in the breeze. It wasn't hers. It was older, tarnished, familiar. Rachel's. Somehow, someone had returned it to the tree. And for Leah, that was enough. Not proof, not explanation, just presence. And that was all Rachel ever needed: to be seen, remembered, and finally understood. As winter approached, a blanket of soft snow covered Emeryville, turning the church grounds into something almost holy. The tree in the memorial garden stood tall, its bare branches dotted with lockets, now frosted like delicate ornaments. People still came, even in the cold, some with thermoses of tea, others simply with silence. It had become a sacred ritual, visiting the place not to mourn, but to witness healing unfold with the seasons. Leah had grown used to the occasional visitor stopping her on the street to say thank you, or to share their own memory of Rachel. Some were older now, people who had been children during the time of her disappearance. They spoke of her like a myth, but with tenderness, reverence. "She was the reason I started telling the truth," one woman whispered. Leah nodded, no words needed. Because Rachel wasn't just a memory anymore. She had become a movement. One snowy afternoon, Naomi stopped by Leah's home. They sat by the fireplace, warm drinks in hand, thumbing through a scrapbook Naomi had compiled. Photos of Rachel, newspaper clippings, letters from strangers across the world. At the very back, Naomi had placed a single page, a copy of Rachel's last known journal entry, now framed in gold leaf. It read, "Even if they forget me, I won't forget who I am." Leah read it aloud, her voice catching on the final word. Naomi reached over, covering her hand, both women tethered to something eternal. That night, Leah couldn't sleep. She stood by her window, watching the snow fall in gentle swirls under the street lamp. She thought of how many winters Rachel had missed, how many birthdays, how many songs. And yet, her presence felt alive in every part of the town, not just in plaques and ceremonies, but in people's choices, in their willingness to care, to speak, to stay. And in that moment, Leah realized something. Rachel had never been waiting to be found. She had been waiting to be felt, and now she was. In every act of courage, in every softened heart, in every truth that once trembled but finally stepped into the light. The following spring brought with it a new chapter. The town council voted unanimously to rename the road that led to St. Emery's. It would now be called Rachel's Way. The announcement was made at a community picnic, and when the sign was unveiled, The crowd broke into applause, not out of ceremony, but out of gratitude, for the girl they had once overlooked, for the voice they had finally learned to hear. The change was symbolic, yes, but more than that, it was direction. Rachel's way became a metaphor for choosing empathy over silence, courage over convenience. Teachers used it in lessons. Counselors referenced it in sessions. And on quiet afternoons, Leah would walk its length, watching children ride their bikes over the painted white letters, unaware of how many lives had once unraveled just beyond that bend. One day, Leah received a package in the mail. No return address. Inside, small photo album. Each page held a photo of a girl, different faces, different ages, different countries. But each one had the same caption written beneath. Because of Rachel, I spoke. Leah turned the final page and found a note. You don't know us, but we know her. Thank you for bringing her voice into the world. Tears welled in her eyes. This wasn't closure. This was legacy. At that moment, a knock sounded at the door. A young woman stood there, nervous but determined. She introduced herself as an aspiring filmmaker who wanted to tell Rachel's story, not to exploit it, but to honor it. Leah hesitated, then invited her in. They sat together for hours, poring over journals, timelines, memories. The young woman asked, "What do you think Rachel would want people to remember most?" Leah smiled softly, that even if no one believes you at first, the truth has a way of surviving, just like she did. Outside, the tree in the memorial garden blossomed with the first hints of spring, and on one of its branches, Rachel's original locket caught the light, spinning gently in the breeze, like a heartbeat refusing to be forgotten. As the film project gained momentum, Leah watched from a respectful distance. She offered guidance when asked, but never sought to control the narrative. She had learned long ago that Rachel's story belonged to many now, not in pieces, but as a living thread woven through lives and time. The director, a thoughtful woman named Clara, handled everything with great care. She insisted on filming the final scenes on location, inside the church, under the tree, and at the very wall where the locket had been found. On the first day of filming, the cast and crew held a moment of silence before the cameras rolled. It wasn't in the script. It wasn't a requirement, but someone had quietly suggested it, and everyone agreed. Leah attended that first shoot, sitting near the organ, watching the actress playing Rachel walk slowly across the sanctuary in soft lighting. There was something haunting about it, something deeply familiar. And when the young actress paused by the stained glass window and turned, Leah swore she saw Rachel's eyes looking back. News of the film spread quickly. Media outlets picked it up. People who had never heard of Rachel's story before began to reach out. Survivors, teachers, clergy. Each letter carried its own weight, its own history. The story was no longer just local. It was universal. A quiet girl who disappeared had become a symbol of all the voices that had gone ignored for too long. The mystery was still present, but now it was partnered with meaning. Leah and Naomi visited Rachel's old bedroom together one last time. It had been preserved, quietly, for decades. They sat on the edge of the bed and read from the stack of new letters sent by children around the world. One read, "I never told anyone until now. I didn't know I could. Thank you, Rachel." Another simply said, "I'm not invisible anymore." The girls may never meet, but they were bonded by something sacred, the belief that someone, somewhere, would hear them. And as Leah stood up to leave, she turned one last time and whispered, "You did it, sweetheart. You broke the silence." Behind her, the sun filtered through the curtains, casting soft light on Rachel's bookshelf, where the old, tattered Bible still rested, open to the verse she had underlined as a child. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. The premiere of the film was held in a modest community theater, not far from where Rachel had vanished all those years ago. It was an intentional choice. Claire wanted the story to begin where it had started. The room was packed. Locals, survivors, reporters, young people who had only ever known Rachel as legend. Leah sat quietly in the front row, her heart steady but full. Naomi held her hand. As the lights dimmed and the screen flickered to life, there was a reverent hush, as if the entire room was holding its breath. The film didn't dramatize Rachel's pain. It honored it. It didn't chase sensationalism. It sought truth. And when the scene came where the locket was discovered behind the organ wall, not a single person in the room moved. Some cried. Others simply stared. It wasn't just a moment on screen. It was a reckoning, a return, a resurrection. When the film ended, no applause came at first. Just silence. The kind of silence that means something has landed deep. Then, one person stood, then another. And slowly, the room rose in a standing ovation. Not just for the film, but for Rachel. For every child who had felt unseen. For every truth that had been silenced and had now, finally, found air. Outside, under the stars, Leah was approached by a little girl who had come with her grandmother. She clutched a small handmade locket, fashioned from paper and string. "I made this for her," the girl said, "so she knows she's not alone up there." Leah knelt down, tears in her eyes, and hugged the girl tight. "She knows," she whispered, "because you remembered." And so, Rachel's story didn't end. It lived on, in hearts, in voices, in every whisper turned into a word. Her disappearance was never solved in the way people hoped. But maybe that wasn't the point. Maybe the real miracle was not in uncovering where she went, but in discovering what she left behind, a world more willing to listen, to see, and to love out loud. Some stories don't end with clear answers. They end with transformation. Rachel's disappearance left behind a mystery, but what truly echoed through time was not what we never found, but what we finally learned to see. Her silence became a voice louder than any sermon, stronger than any stone wall. It was through the stillness of her absence that a town learned to listen, not only to her, but to every unheard cry that once echoed in secret. Over the course of nearly 4 decades, Rachel's name changed from a whisper of sorrow to a symbol of strength, not because she returned, but because her presence never truly left. Her locket, once sealed in darkness, became the beacon that unlocked countless stories hidden behind shame and fear. The truth wasn't just behind the organ. It had always been behind the silence of those afraid to speak. And now, finally, the silence had been broken. Each person who stood beneath the tree of remembrance, who hung their own letter, who lit a candle in Rachel's name, became part of a movement that dared to confront pain with light. And if there's one lesson her story leaves behind, it's this. Even when the world forgets to look, even when voices fade, there is always someone watching, waiting, ready to remember. And remembering, truly remembering, is the first step toward healing. So when you walk past a quiet church, or see a child who has stopped speaking, or feel the weight of something unspoken pressing in your chest, think of Rachel. Think of the girl whose truth refused to die. Let it move you. Let it open something in you. Because one voice can shift the world, but only if others are brave enough to echo it. If this story moved you, if something in Rachel's journey spoke to a part of your soul, stay with us. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story that needs to be told. Like the video if you felt even a flicker of connection. And most importantly, share your thoughts in the comments below. Because your voice matters. Your truth matters. And together, maybe we can make sure no one is ever forgotten again.